So I'm going to talk, as you heard, about Trump and the environment. And I'm going to give you a sort of an economic analysis of Trump's environmental actions. Now, when you look at Trump's environmental policy, economic analysis isn't actually what comes to mind at first. When you look at Scott Pruitt, who was until recently director of the EPA, I think it's outright corruption is what screams at you as the first obvious feature of his regime as running the EPA. But anyway, I'll leave that on one side and try to sort of give you an economic analysis of what Trump has been doing, what might be the justifications, and what might be the causes and effects. To do that, I need to take a historical perspective, try to look at environmental policy in a historical context. We need to go back in time to the 19th century, to a time when we believed strongly in the Smithian approach to economics and to economic policy making, when we believed that the invisible hand was real and really did lead to socially benign outcomes. Okay? Now, towards the end of the 19th century, we began to have some questions about the invisible hand. We began to introduce antitrust policy, things of that sort. But that, of course, was still really, in many ways, Smithian. Smith was very much concerned about monopoly policy and things of that sort. In the 1920s, the sort of earlier part of the 20th century, economists began to focus more sharply on this concept of the invisible hand as something which produces socially, economically benign outcomes. And began to see limitations in it, quite a number of limitations. And I think that to anybody who's taken basic economics courses today, the nature of those limitations is very familiar and absolutely standard. Began to worry about external costs, began to worry about public goods, about missing markets, about a whole range of things which can kind of compromise the effectiveness of the invisible hand. And in this I'm referring to work by people like Pigou, Langer, Lerner, Samuelson, Coase, basically the beginnings of modern welfare economics and everything we teach our students in a kind of an intermediate micro course. And all of that essentially acted to qualify, and not to discredit, but to qualify significantly this concept of an invisible hand of the competitive market leading to socially efficient outcomes. Now, these ideas eventually fed through into economic policy, but not for quite a long time. I mean, the ideas were developed in the 20s and 30s. They began to have an impact on policy in the 50s and 60s. I mean, that's perhaps understandable. Ideas take a long time to feed through. In the interim, we had the Great Depression and the Second World War, so there obviously were higher priorities than dealing with these ideas. But in the 1950s and 60s, there were a number of things that occurred that really put these ideas back onto the agenda very firmly. One was things like environmental scandals like the Love Canal events, the analysis of DDT and the impact of DDT on bird populations. Perhaps above everything, the publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which was in 1962. That book had a really big impact on popular debate, on popular consciousness about environmental problems and the growth of environmental problems. And that, I think, gave a sort of an impetus to public concern about environmental issues. To use a hackneyed phrase, it led to perhaps a tipping point in terms of public concern about the environment. And in the next decade, a huge amount of environmental legislation was passed, which is basically the legislation we live with and work with today. So it was a really an amazing burst, actually, of environmental legislation between 63, right after Rachel Carson's book, and 73. So in that decade, the Endangered Species Act was passed, the Clean Air Act was passed, the Clean Water Act was passed, and the Environmental Protection Agency was established. And those, if you're familiar with the area, those are basically they provide the framework for environmental policy today. There really have been very few changes in the environmental legislation field since those acts were passed. They were passed by the earlier ones by Lyndon Johnson, the later ones by Richard Nixon. And what is sort of interesting in retrospect is that they really were passed with bipartisan support. If you look at the debates at the time, and you look at press reporting on these issues at the time, then there was almost universal agreement amongst Republicans and Democrats that these were appropriate and necessary pieces of legislation. And the problems were very real. And if you ask most environmental groups who were the most pro-environmental presidents the US has ever had, then if you ask them to list the top three, they almost invariably include Nixon and Roosevelt, along with Johnson. So two of the top three are actually Republicans rather than Democrats. I find that very interesting. I mean, there was a very different political attitude towards environmental issues in the 50s and 60s and going into the 70s from what we have today. And it's, as I said just now, the only changes that have really occurred since then are the Reagan's signature of the Montreal Protocol. This was the protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, phasing out the use of CFCs. Reagan signed that. And then in 1990, Bush 1 introduced Clean Air Act amendments, which introduced a cap and trade system for phasing out the production of sulfur dioxide by burning coal in power stations. And those two are both with us today and have been very successful pieces of legislation. So apart from both incidentally by Republican presidents, obviously, Reagan and Bush. So the bulk of the environmental legislation we have today was established in the 60s. It was passed by Republican presidents, and the only significant additions to it have been by Republican presidents. And there's, that gives you some food for thought. I mean, I actually find it very difficult to understand how the sort of the political positioning on environmental issues has come to change so radically in the last few decades. Now today, the environmental issues are a touchstone of the culture wars. I mean, you can tell everything about a person's lifestyle and their political beliefs by their environmental position. That was clearly not true in the 60s and 70s, and I'd like to understand much better why that's happened. I've written a little bit about this and thought about it a bit, but I'm far from convinced that I really understand it. So the fact that we no longer have a consensus in favor of environmental issues has allowed Trump to roll back, basically back towards the late 19th century, a lot of this legislation which has been put in place. He's sort of aiming back to an era where there were no external costs, where markets never failed, and the invisible hand universally led to benign outcomes. That's the sort of world that Trump would justify Trump's positions on these things. The only attempts at intellectual justification of what Trump has been doing are really in terms of the need for job creation. And there's been a lot of discussion by Trump, of course, of the coal industry. That's his iconic example of an industry damaged by environmental regulation. So let me talk a little bit about the coal industry and about this idea that the coal industry has been damaged by environmental legislation. That's the market capitalization of the US coal industry, according to Bloomberg. It reached a peak of $35 billion in roughly 2010, and it's now worth effectively zero, just a couple of $1 billion. It would buy an apartment block in New York, something like that. So there's certainly, from an economic perspective, the US coal industry has been wiped out. And it's not just true of the US coal industry, it's true of the coal industries in most countries, incidentally. So why is that? Well, it certainly wasn't driven by environmental policy, actually. It was driven, this gives you some clue as to what it was driven by. It's maybe difficult to read from the back, so let me tell you what that graph is. On the vertical axis, you've got the cost of generating a megawatt hour of electricity. And on the horizontal axis, you've got time, going from 2009 to the present. And each line on that shows the cost of generating a megawatt hour of electricity by a particular technology. And this line here, whoops, sorry about that. Let's go back. The top line here is the cost of solar power, the cost of generating electricity from solar power, which at the start of the decade was very high, at the end of the decade was very, very low. This line here is the cost of power from coal. Stayed pretty much constant over the whole time. There are three ways of generating power which are much, much cheaper than coal. One is solar, one is wind, and one is natural gas. Natural gas used to be more expensive, but of course fracking drove down the price of natural gas massively, from roughly $12 a million BTU to $2.5 to $3 a million BTU. And because of that, generating power from gas became much, much cheaper than generating power from coal. So from about 2008 onwards, no one has built a coal-fired power station in the US. And that wasn't because of coal or because of wind and solar, that was initially because of gas. Gas-fired power stations were just a lot cheaper. No one in their right mind would have built coal. Now in the last 2 or 3 years, and this is what this diagram shows, quite interesting, the lowest two lines here are wind and solar. The third one up is gas. For the last 2 years, the cheapest ways of producing power in the US have been wind and solar. This data incidentally comes from Lazard's. I've just cut it straight off the Lazard website. Lazard, the investment bank, does a lot of work in the energy area, a lot of work with electric utilities. So they post this data on a regular basis, and the previous diagram came from Bloomberg. So what's happening in this business is that the destruction of the market value of the coal industry has not been a function of environmental regulations at all. It's been a function of the drop in the price of natural gas, the drop in the price of wind, and the drop in the price of solar. And rolling back environmental regulation will not affect any of those things. Although Trump has spoken about recreating the coal industry and creating jobs in the coal industry by abolishing environmental regulation, that is, to put it bluntly, just so much BS. That will not happen. No one in their right mind would build a coal-fired power station in the United States today, given the economics of wind, solar, and natural gas. Now, there are other issues going on. In the other countries in particular, coal has been phased out, or is being phased out, because it's a very dirty fuel. So it's not just an issue of competition from other fuels. I mean, if you look at countries like China and India, they're consciously trying to move away from coal. And there, what's driving the concern there is not the fact that gas is cheaper, because it isn't in those countries. They don't have cheap natural gas like we do. What's driving the concern there is just urban pollution. Pollution levels in India and China are absolutely horrifying. And a lot of that pollution is driven by burning coal. So it's the concern about the dirtiness of burning coal that's driving other countries away from coal. Burning coal produces what are called PM 2.5, very, very fine particles. Particles are sufficiently fine, they go into your lungs. They go through the tissues in your lungs into your blood. They can even go from your blood into your brain. And there's an increasing amount of research, which I'll mention in a minute, that shows that these particles do a great deal of harm to people's health. Produces mercury, lead, and chromium. Mercury, lead, and chromium are all dangerous heavy metals, which are abundant in coal. When you burn coal and release the byproducts into the atmosphere, you release those metals into the atmosphere too. Produces oxides of nitrogen. In some cases, it produces oxides of sulfur as well. Some coal contains sulfur. And a whole range of other things. And all of these contribute to the formation of ozone, of ground-level ozone. There was an interesting study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, published 2 years ago, which shows that burning coal in China reduces the life expectancy of the average inhabitant of a Chinese conurbation by 5 years. There's probably about 1 billion people live in conurbations in China. So about 1 billion people are having their life expectancy reduced by 5 years because of the pollution generated by burning coal in China. Gives you some sense of the scope of the issue that's going on here. Coal is also a major contributor to climate change. When you burn 1 ton of coal, it leads to 2.4 tons of CO2. And a big power station burns roughly 6,000 tons of coal a day. That's a pile of coal the size of this building. And that leads to 7 million tons of CO2 a year. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of coal-fired power stations all around the world doing that, which is where a lot of our CO2 emissions come from. Now, there was a very interesting study by some people at the Harvard School of Public Health a couple of years ago who estimated the external costs associated with burning coal. And they estimated if you were to try to include in the price of coal the external costs associated with burning coal, then that would put the price of electricity from coal up from about 7 cents a kilowatt hour to about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. A typical spot price for electricity in New York is somewhere between 5 and 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So that would price it right out of the market, completely out of the market. Okay, now these, I mentioned this of the public health aspect of burning coal, and one of the things which I think is most inappropriate about the Trump regulations is not just that the intellectual foundation for what they're doing is non-existent, but that this is a particularly inappropriate and unfortunate time for rolling back regulations on the public health field. Because for the last couple of years, almost every week, a new study has crossed my desk showing how we have been seriously underestimating the public health impacts of pollution. And actually quite remarkable how far-reaching the public health impacts of urban pollution are and how little we've understood about this. So one of the things which come out of these studies very clearly, some of them actually done by colleagues of Angus Deaton's at Princeton, is that exposure of a mother to pollution, of a pregnant woman to pollution, leads to significant health impacts for the child. So exposure in utero to pollution has been found to have lifetime impacts on children's health, and in particular on their IQ. So that's a very interesting piece of documentation. It's also been shown that, again, an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just a couple of weeks ago, that heavy exposure to pollution affects people's IQ, even occurs during adulthood. So we're dumbing ourselves down by heavy and prolonged exposure to pollution. As I mentioned, these very fine particles, PM 2.5 microns in diameter or less, have the capacity to go through lung tissues into your blood and through the blood-brain barrier into your brain. There was also an article I was reading just a couple of days ago showing that these actually penetrate into the fetus of pregnant women. So this pollution actually affects the unborn child quite directly through being physically present in the unborn child. And in adults, PM 2.5 leads to heart and respiratory diseases. And again, the bulk of these very, very fine particles are produced by the combustion of coal. That's the principal source of all of these things. I mean, some of it comes from diesel engines, poorly regulated diesel engines, but here in the US, most diesels are sufficiently efficient that they don't produce a lot of this very fine particulate. And the worst culprit by far is the combustion of coal. Gas, for example, is much, much cleaner. I mean, gas produces half as much CO2 as coal does per megawatt hour of electricity produced. And it produces much, much less. It produces nothing in the way of particulates and less in the way of SO2. And generally less in the way of NOx2. So what emerges from all of these studies is that there's hardly any aspect of human health which is not made worse by the pollution that the administration is now increasing. And it's very clear from these studies that an objective cost-benefit analysis of environmental regulations would show that they are hugely beneficial. Another interesting point, which is, I think, worth emphasizing, though I'm sure it's not of great concern to the administration, is that many of the costs of pollution fall more on low-income groups than on high-income groups. An example I like to give my students, which is a very traditional one, is that anybody who's familiar with London knows that the west end of London is the fancy end of London, where the rich people live, and the east end of London is the poor end of London, where poor people live. Now, the wind in London always blows from the west to the east. Which is a very solid historical reason for that. So the pollution always got blown from the rich end of town to the poor end of town. And the river, of course, also flows from west to east. So then all the sewage got washed down from the rich end to the poor end. So segregation by exposure to environmental issues is not a new phenomenon at all. But it's quite real today as it was in London hundreds of years ago. Though there are some aspects of pollution which are so widespread that it's virtually impossible to avoid them wherever you live, and exposure to pesticide residues is certainly one of those. That's stuff which gets into food and is virtually unavoidable, however you live your lifestyle. So just let me bring this to a conclusion. The Trump administration is really rejecting a significant part of 20th century economics, everything we understand about welfare economics, external costs, public goods, and a whole range of things like that, and reverting back to a solid belief in the invisible hand and its virtues. They're also rejecting scientific and epidemiological studies that show the massive human health costs of pollution. As I said, almost every week I see new studies suggesting that the health cost of pollution is significantly worse than we had believed before. They're trying to preserve an industry, the coal industry, whose time is long since past. The coal industry was the foundation of the Industrial Revolution back in the 1800s, maybe even in the late 1700s. It's passé at this point. No one in their right mind would build a new coal-fired power station in any industrial country. And they're also, by doing this, they're blocking the US's movement to technologies which are the future technologies. There's virtually no question that in most of the world, energy will be generated by renewable energy sources 50 years from now, 25 years from now even, and that vehicles will be electric. And the US needs to be moving in that direction. Shouldn't be investing in the coal industry. We should be investing in the solar industry, and the wind industry, and the electric vehicle industry. Thanks, guys.